Hello and welcome back to another episode of Working Class Fishing. I am John Morris. We have Brian Keachley, and our special guest today is Ryan King. Ryan, thanks so much for coming on, man. How are you today?
Hey, I'm doing great. I'm doing great. We just had about 3 inches of rain, and it's been it's been a rainy, incredibly rainy, wet, summer here in Texas. So, but it's been cool. So that's on the bright side. It's unusually cool here. So, but yeah, I'm doing great. Thanks for asking.
Hey, no problem, man. And dude, I'm kind of like overwhelmed right now. It's almost starstruck, right? I You are the Texas state record holder alligator gar angler on the fly. That is that's a title, sir. That is amazing. How did you end up? Well, first off, we'll get to that here in a second, but dude, tell us about yourself, Ryan.
Sure, sure. Well, I mean, me being in Texas came about a fairly circuitous route. So I was born in Detroit, Michigan. Don't remember being there. Grew up in, as I was telling Brian, you guys a minute ago, grew up in Portland, Oregon, and was really pretty much like a trout fisherman. Really at a young age, got into fly fishing, just fishing in general. I was just my dad took me at a young age, and uh, there's pictures of me holding trout, that we caught just on a little like Zebco reel and a bobber and worms. And every time we drove by a water body, I'd stare out the window and was just begging to stop and wanted to fish. And my dad was a fly fisherman, and he would tie flies, and he would go to the Deschutes River sometimes with his friends. And of course I was too little, and I would like to go in and kind of watch him tie flies. And he would be out of practice, and he'd be kind of cursing every once in a while about breaking his thread or whatever. And so I knew that was a time to leave. But a lot of times I would get in after he would leave, and kind of mess around a little bit with his fly tying stuff. And eventually got to where I started doing a little fly fishing, and just he had a bunch of books, and that's really how I learned how to tie flies at a pretty young age. They were really poor at first. And I looked at this today now with like YouTube and Instagram, and the free level of instruction that's out there right now for fly tying is just unbelievable compared to what it was like when I was a kid. I mean, it was like, there were a handful of really very poorly made, like VHS tapes, like Jack Dennis, or some of these old timer, the Scientific Anglers Mastery series. And if you all remember that. And by the way, that is now like on YouTube for free. Like they've put all those old videos on there. So if you want to go take a trip down memory lane, and that may be actually before you guys' time. I'm pretty old, but all that stuff's on there now. But yeah, I tied flies and ended up actually starting tied flies commercially when I was started at 15 years old, and tied flies until I've just about finished grad school. So there was a place in Portland called Kaufman Streamborn.
Yeah.
Randall Kaufman has several books out, and was primarily famous initially for his book American Nymph Fly Tying Manual, and then tying nymphs, and then he had tying dry flies and bone fishing and other things. And so I learned from it, really got good learning from him and his books. And I would bring flies in, and he'd critique them, and he was somebody I looked up to, who was a mentor. And then it got to be where in the summer, I just would do big orders of flies. A lot of times it was just filling like what they needed. And then it got to be where it was like steelhead flies primarily. And I would have hundreds of dozens. Sometimes I think one year I tied, didn't quite make 1,000 dozen, but So I'd have a little kitchen timer, and I would set it there. And as you know, at least John, I assume both you tie flies, but I know John, you do some commercial tying, right? Or do you both do commercial tying?
No, I don't. I don't do any tying at all. I do lure making more so.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's all a game of like, basically just as fewest minimum number of touches and how fast you can go and just getting it down. And so it was a race against that kitchen timer, and because I knew, and eventually got to where I was able to average about 2 dozen an hour in steelhead flies, and at that time I was making pretty decent money. So ended up leaving Oregon to go to college in Arkansas, of all places. But one of the reasons why I went there was several of my friends went to the school there. I didn't really have a clear direction in what I wanted to do in life. And there was Little Red River was about 20 minutes from campus. And I'd heard that there was some pretty decent trout fishing there. And it just so happened that I got there right about the time that the brown trout really started to come on. They had actually put some brown trout egg boxes in there, and these fish were actually naturally reproducing, which there's not a lot of natural reproduction for rainbows and other things. And so my very first year at Harding, I caught a 17-pound brown trout on Red River.
That's a big fish.
and then I had a replica mount made of it. And then the next year I ended up catching a 23-pound brown trout at night fishing a big black leech. And so I was just crazy. All I did was basically I'd go to class and then I'd fish, girls, I didn't care. I was just, it's all about fishing. So ended up going to grad school at Duke University in North Carolina, and did a master's in a water resource management program. And then I really realized that research was really more of my passion. And so I worked for a year at the university in a lab, and then ended up going back for my PhD, and did my PhD work in the Everglades, and would always manage to do a little fishing while I was down there, and ended up finishing there at Duke. Went on to the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center in Maryland. Lived in Annapolis for 2.5 years. And I was happy to get out of that area because it was extremely expensive, very crowded, and extremely, like, the commute, the driving in the DC area is just, I'm sure I lost years off my life.
Sitting in traffic. Yeah.
I mean, yeah. And just, it's just like the number of times that you get honked at for like nothing there is just unbelievable. So there was this opportunity at Baylor. They were recruiting in aquatic ecologists who did more or less what I did, and they were really interested in building their research program and their grad program, and the attractiveness of affordable housing, a mid-sized kind of college town, it seemed like a good choice, and it ended up being a great move for me. But in terms of fishing, what that meant was I had to sort of change, my targets. And there's one pretty well-known trout stream in Texas. That's the Guadalupe River below Canyon. And I was pretty spoiled by native fisheries in the Northwest and other places I fished. I did skip that. I had guided some on the San Juan River in New Mexico when I was in college, and so I'd been out there. So I fished like all those great tailwaters, and so I wasn't too enamored with trying to be a trout guy coming to Texas. Not to say that there's anything wrong with that. It's great, but I was pretty intrigued by some of the native species that, and particularly ones that people didn't target all that much. And gar happened to be one of those species. And I've gotten to be where I'm just, yeah, I mean, I obviously I'll fish for most species. I enjoy catching lots of different fish on flies, including going down to the coast for redfish and things like that. But gar are just really intriguing to me for a lot of reasons. I think they're a really underappreciated sport fish, and then of course the alligator gar being arguably it's white sturgeon technically is the largest species of fish in North America, but they're kind of semi-cartilaginous of the true, like completely bony fishes. Alligator gar is the largest in North America. I mean, and to have these fish just right here, and the fact that when we first moved here, I mean, they're still mostly regarded as a nuisance, to people who like jug line for catfish, and then there's mostly guys who just bow fish for them. And then there kind of came this tipping point where there were a handful of guys who were doing, guiding for alligator gar with bait, basically with bait. And then I think it really took off when like Jeremy Wade did that River Monsters show. Mm-hmm. That was sort of like the major tipping point where now it's this international attention and people are coming from all over the world to try to catch alligator gar in Texas. But so those guys are actually getting a lot of attention and maybe even in some protection. Even the regs have changed since I've been here, and we're hoping that maybe some of the work that we're doing, we're actually doing some gar research, will help that maybe move into an even more conservation-minded direction. But the other species tend not to get the same level of love as long-nosed gar is the other species I really like to target, because while they don't get as big as alligator gar, they are probably they're more widely distributed, and they're more accessible to a lot of people, and they're they still get big, and they readily take flies, and they're and I really like to sight fish. I mean, that's kind of my favorite thing to do, and either walking along a riverbank just waiting to see one kind of cruising along, or in a boat just waiting and looking for cruising fish, and then just a lot of times because of their behavior, it gives you just kind of like much like a lot of prize saltwater fish, where you essentially have a few seconds to make the cast before they spook or they disappear. And a lot of times they'll come up and they're getting ready to gulp, and they gulp, but they go back down and you don't see them. And so you're not on it. And so it's still a real challenge to like hit them. You got to hit them right in the nose. And then when you do, and they take, I mean, some of them they pull, and they're fun though. Some of them will jump. I've got a few Instagram like slow-mo videos of fish doing them, they're so at any rate, I've kind of been rambling here.
No, you're good, dude.
No, you're good. Yeah,
this is awesome.
No, what's fascinating to me is that you had the foresight, and your educational background and your work in research and everything would warrant that you would have that forward thinking kind of idea to go out and maybe target something that wasn't necessarily targeted, but you knew it was a big fish and you knew that it'd be a lot of fun. Kind of stepping back into some of your earlier fishing, obviously I'm stepping back here because you growing up here in the Pacific Northwest and fishing and angling, and then obviously commercially tying and mentioning some of our great rivers and streams and stuff. when you were younger, and the reason I ask this question is because we do have some younger folks that listen to the podcast.
Yeah.
How old were you when you first got a fly rod in your hand? And then when you did get the fly rod in your hand, what species, obviously you fished trout, but you were tying steelhead flies. At what point in that transition did you transition from, our good old red sides onto the chutes to, our summer steelhead onto the chutes, or, maybe targeting the winter steelhead? But what age did you start fly fishing, and when did you start transitioning into some of the larger fish species?
I think I was about 10 when I got my first fly rod. And I remember, I think one of the first fish I caught on decent fish that I caught on a fly was, we were on the Metolius River.
Okay.
at near Camp Sherman.
Yeah.
And the Metolius, they have some that are stocked fish. And so I think, Dad had helped set me up with, I think I had like an Adams on or something like that.
Yeah.
And I was somewhere maybe 100 yards upstream from him, kind of running like kids do, you sort of take off and just, and I still vividly remember, like casting, and I don't even really remember seeing the fish take it or anything. It may have just been like a swinging it, who knows what was going on, but I got this, like probably 12, 13 inch stalker rainbow that I caught and landed. And there was this older gentleman who was just downstream of me, and like had this look on his face like, what the heck, this kid just came over here and caught a fish. And he came over and he's like, all right, let's look at this. And that they clipped the adipose fin. That's how you could tell it was a stalker or not, because he was going to help me like release it. Cause I was just ecstatic at this trout. And he's like, oh, it's a hatchery fish, you can keep it. And so I was like, oh, and I ran down and I was like, dad, look. And he was kind of like, pretty stunned, Frank, it was just luck. But as a kid, it seemed like, he would say like, I just seemed like I was just lucky. Like I tended to catch fish. and sometimes it would almost annoy. But yeah, he took me fishing whenever he could. And, he was a pretty busy guy, but yeah, going to the Deschutes really became our thing. And, walking up the railroad tracks up from Maupin, that was a spot we would fish a lot. And, elk hair caddisses in the evening, or certainly during the salmon fly hatch.
Oh, anything then. Yeah.
Yeah.
Throw a flip flop.
I'd wade out and, I'm trying to throw up underneath the willows. And, lots of flies lost in brush,
you go for your back cast and like that.
Oh yeah.
Like,
Okay, so much of that. Yeah. I learned
a lot of that.
I learned how to swear on the Deschutes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, but to tell you the truth, I did a little bit of steelhead fishing, but I look back on it, I didn't actually do that much steelhead fishing. I still was really focused on trout. I had a couple other friends who were, had an older friend who also helped teach me how to tie flies, and he was an excellent tyer, and he was really into fishing technical situations, like really small dries, and so we did. So I was always trying to tie, match the hatch sorts of things. I was really keyed into that. Sometimes we'd go up to some of the lakes in Eastern Washington, like Nunnally and Lanice, I think they were called. And that there's some big, Lahontan cutthroats up there.
Yeah.
Crane Prairie, we'd go sometimes and fish for some big rainbows with dams transition to big fish happened when I went to Arkansas and just happened to catch huge browns. And and then from there, once I went to grad school, my amount of time, my fishing just really, I didn't fish very much, and did a little bit in North Carolina, like of near inshore, just offshore fishing for like false albacore. There was a kind of, I was happened to be there when that was sort of peaking near, it was called Cape Lookout, and these albacore would come basically following bait down the eastern coast in the fall, and I mean, just busting bait, and one of the hardest fighting fish for its size that I ever caught. Maryland, a little bit of striper action, some hickory shad, and then came to Texas, and so yeah, I mean, I sort of just kind of was opportunistic about what was available, and I didn't really have a boat, and I had float tube. I did some crazy things in a float tube. Sometimes I like floating the Little Red River at night. And had a close call with a beaver. I won't go into that. That didn't sound right.
It's all right. Because beavers are one of those animals. Same with nutria. Beavers and nutria, and who knows what other swamp rodents are out there, but they got teeth, and they got a tail, and you're in an inflatable tube, and people are like, oh, well, it's a tube. It's like, yeah, this thing's got teeth. It's going to bite through my tube. I'm floating down the river. Now, I did, but it's funny that you bring that up with the float tube and the beaver and all that, because I just think of people that fish in areas where you have a lot of those types of aquatic. I don't know if a beaver's considered a rodent. I know a nutria.
Yeah, they definitely are rodents. Absolutely.
Okay. So you have we'll call them aquatic rodents running
around,
and you're like, hey, I'm just chilling out fishing, and here comes this thing with these big buck teeth at you. You're kind of like, whoa, hey, yeah. So I opted for the kayak over the float tube. It's just kind of like, they got to get through the roto molding to get to me. So
I look back on it, and I wish I had, like these sit on top fishing kayaks were more of a thing back then. They really weren't. Fly fishing was pretty much like a float tube, or that was kind of about it. So so
that's just super cool, though. You're like I said, for John, he's just kind of like, hey, this guy's fishes gar, this is my thing, I know. And then you're dropping names of all these legendary streams and rivers around me here. It's kind of it just kind of it gets me wound up, because I think about, like, when you're sitting there saying, yeah, we were up in Camp Sherman fishing, I'm like, yeah, okay, so I know here, and I'm envisioning like, here's a 10-year-old kid whipping Adams out into just kind of a tail out or something like that, loading up like a 13-inch stalker out of the hatchery. It's like, dude, come on. It's so cool. So no, thanks for kind of giving that backfill on that, though. That's super cool.
Yeah, well, it's still a vivid memory.
Yeah, it's just super cool.
Yeah.
So you come to Texas, you've got all this amazing experience. You're very well versed and educated in what you enjoy doing, which is research and fishing. So at what point did you say, I'm really going to knuckle down and I'm going to start targeting gar?
I had a close friend who's not in the area anymore, who I went to college with, and he lived kind of in the Tyler area, and he had originally kind of got me on to going for targeting gar a little bit, and initially, like, there wasn't all that much out there about flies to use or anything. So, we did a lot of experimenting and with flies for gar, just to be clear. And then it became pretty obvious to us, like, there's well, first of all, to back up, there's really like three predominant species. There's a fourth one. So there's spotted, longnose, and alligator. And there's some short-nosed gar, particularly in East Texas as well. Spotted and short-nose tend not to get particularly large, and so, but on light tackle with smaller flies, they're still fun to target. But all of the gar species have just incredibly bony, hard mouths. They have a mandible and a maxilla that's mostly just bone with a very thin veneer of tough skin, and then they've got all these teeth. And so there's not much to hook, in terms of jamming a hook into that and getting it to stick, and so we played with all sorts of different patterns. I mean, I've got a box that's about 12 years old that's full of patterns that we could get that come off most of the time. And we experimented with lots of like trailer hooks, stinger type hooks, even like treble hooks. I know there's a guide who's on Instagram who's one of the few who that I know of that really goes after longnose a lot. He catches a lot of really big ones, and he sounds like he's kind of worked out a good technique using a fly that has a trailer treble hook. I tried that, and I haven't had very much success in landing fish. His situation up there, I think, is a little different too. Is that it looks like that water that he fishes is in Tennessee is really clear, and there may be like a large abundance of fish, and it may be that they miss a lot and land a few. I don't know, but he clearly is catching some. So kudos to him and whatever method he's sort of worked out. But we would catch a few, but we vast majority we lose. And then I'd heard of this using frayed nylon rope for gar, and again, at this point I'm mostly just talking about longnose gar, and so I went ahead and brought some on this trip, and we're fishing on the Neches River, not far from Tyler, and man, I mean, it went from almost never landing one to like 75 to 80% of the takes we would land the fish. And we started scaling up our flies. We used different colors, and started to learn that color sometimes did actually matter, not necessarily the rope itself, but like the front of the flies. We'd fish different colors. We'd see what was happening. If the fish were up cruising, we'd sight fish them. If they were down deeper, we'd sometimes fish sinking lines where we knew they were gulpers and they were down deep, and we'd fish real slow sinking lines and catch them that way. But it was like, I mean, the term game changer, but it was, I mean, it just suddenly became where not only were we, catching, majority of the takes, which for fly fishing of any species, really, I mean, I would guess that in most species, if you land 50% of the fish that you get a take on, that's pretty good ratio. I mean, we're really doing better, consistently better than that. And but you have to kind of unlearn using this technique. You have to really kind of unlearn what you've learned about fly fishing and setting the hook, because while we do still have a hook on the front of the fly, and I used to run a trailer hook off the back, a lot of times that gets caught up in the frayed nylon and so forth. The vast majority of the time, the fish is getting its teeth entangled in this frayed nylon rope. So this fly looks amazing in the water. I mean, you can make them look beautiful if you want. I mean, I used to make them look really like big fancy streamers, and I've simplified it a lot. But bottom line was, it really looks like so for longnose gar, their primary food source is gizzard shad. That is probably 90 to 95% of their diet. And gizzard shad have, kind of a silvery back, but a really white belly. And a lot of times when gizzard shad aren't doing well, you'll see, this white belly kind of turning in the water. And I'm convinced, they see that and they just see it as a wounded gizzard shad, and that white color. We put a little flash in there, and but if you look at the way another reason why gar are so difficult to hook is if you well, for one, I've kept gar in aquaria, raised them from fry and fed them and watched them how they eat and feed, and gar do not come like at their prey like straight and engulf it such that like a fly would get back in its jaws. They've got these long jaws for, this is an adaptation. They're mostly ambush feeders. They're not out swimming around trying to chase things down. They will at times, but mostly they're just, they move real slow and they're just cruising and they're waiting for something to not realize that they're there. And something will come by and they'll see it and you'll watch them and they'll turn and they open their jaw and they bite it sideways. So if their jaw is here and so it's in their jaw and so it's in the middle of that jaw and then they'll hold it. And sometimes they'll swim around, they'll swim away and they're trying to hold down on that bait fish. I see longnose swimming around with gizzard shad in their jaws, and they're right pretty much smack dab in the center of the length of that jaw. That's where they're holding it, and they're holding it so that the fish is basically perpendicular to their jaw, and they're holding it. And then they'll hold it, and then they'll move it like this, and they'll turn it just a little bit, and they'll gradually start working that fish back toward their throat, and then they'll finally swallow. And they can actually swallow it. Once they get it back there, they can expand it, and they can swallow a pretty big fish. And so when you're fishing with flies, the same, you're basically dealing with the fact that when the way they take it is also going to tend to be predominantly. Now, again, somebody's going to say like, oh, well, I catch them in the back, throw all the time or whatever. I mean, I just know how they feed. And for the most part, if you're trying to hook them in that part of the mouth, it's going to be a fairly low probability venture, So these rope flies are just, they work great. Now, some people will be like, oh, well, then you got to deal with trying to get it out of their mouths and all that. Well, if you've caught a big longnose gar before and you brought it in, you'll know that one of the last things I want, particularly like in my boat, is a longnose gar with like 2 sets of treble hooks in its jaws, because they go crazy. They are extremely difficult to handle. And so I wear, these are just $1.99 latex covered gloves that you can get just about anywhere, work gloves. And sometimes you'll feel the teeth, but I wear these gloves. I don't like to cast with them generally. Once I have the fish on and I've worked it and I'm getting it close to having it in, I'll often like kind of slowly put these gloves on, and then I will grab them. I'll snoot them or snout them. I'll just basically grab them by the snout and lift them up. And then I'm able to bring them in, and I'll try to gently hold, or sometimes I'll just leave them in the water and hold them. And I'm able to kind of pry their jaws open, and then I take a pair of needle nose pliers and start to pull those fibers out. Sometimes I'll just do it with my fingers, with the gloves. Occasionally there's a fish that gets really wrapped up and it takes a little bit longer, but a lot of times I've got that fish unbuttoned in 10 seconds. And so people who say like, oh man, it's just, it's such a pain to try to get that out of their mouths. I'm like, the alternative with treble hooks and things like that is there's a reasonably good chance that you might end up in the ER with these fish. I've had them, where I think they're totally under control, they'll act fine, and then suddenly just completely flip. I've had them, their jaws come and just cut me right in the face or cut my leg. I always wear long shirts, long pants. I'm trying to make it sound like they're scary. They're actually really pretty easy to control once you learn how to do it. But those big ones, I mean, a 50-inch long nose, depending on where you get it, is going to be, fit between 15 and 20 pounds. And, and then you start going up towards the 60-inch long fish, and those fish can be 30, the world record is 62 inches long and 43 pounds. It had a girth like this. It was from the Trinity River in Texas, and Lake Livingston is the last reservoir on the Trinity. And I think consistently, if you look at the IGFA records for longnose gar, most all of them have come for fly fishing anyway, have come from Lake Livingston. And I think some of these really super fat fish that have been caught in the Trinity come up from that lake as well. So any rate, so I guess I should actually maybe show you, I've got this, have you ever seen these like sushi rolls by Fish Pond? Yeah. They work really well for gar flies. And so I've got a mix of rope flies in here, and then some of my alligator gar flies, which I haven't really started talking about yet. But
keep that thought. With that being said, this is the only time I'm going to offer to say, would you like me to blur that out? No, seriously, this is the only time I'm ever going to ask anyone that.
There you go.
All right.
Okay.
All right. So Ryan, you got out some of those flies, and what's interesting is we talk about dry fly patterns, nymphs, all that different kind of stuff. These are streamers, but these are big streamers. They're not little streamers. And folks that fish for predatory species like pike and muskie, of course gar, maybe even some saltwater fish are going to be familiar with something this size. But people that are more of like your trout angler, salmon, or steelhead on the fly, or the other species, they're not going to see streamers this big. So it's just cool because they're so big, and you guys talked about the movement and how they flow through the water and everything else. But you want to show us a couple of those, not the top secret patterns, but the ones.
They're it really, yeah. So I mean, so an example, so for one, I use like a fairly inexpensive Mustad saltwater hook. Is it 34007s? Is that the one I'm thinking of? But and there's a couple of reasons for that. One is they have a pretty large eye, and if you're fishing, what I do is I fish no more than 12 inches of up to 80-pound shock tippet, which you can get away with less than that. And I've very rarely had a fish cut me off, but never when I'm using shock tippet that heavy. And that basically is just a bite guard and you'll get nicks and stuff in it. And then gradually you'll just, you'll change your leader. But if you try to use a lot smaller fly, with a smaller hook, which actually in some ways is better, because a smaller hook with a finer point is more likely to penetrate that bone if you're going to really hook them. And so if I do fish, if I do want to try, a lot of times and this one doesn't have one, but I'll, off the back of the fly, I don't know if that's in focus, I oftentimes will have some wire that's basically doubled over, that I can thread like a small Gamakatsu octopus hook or something on there, but a real small one, and use that as a trailer. Now you could put a treble on there or something if you wanted, but I've gotten we're generally I don't do that, but to really hook them, those finer point, I think hooks will probably work a little bit better. But I do hook them on these, and it depends on where they've taken the fly. But this is an example of one that's been chewed up. Essentially, this is like two strands of braided nylon rope, and I'll cut a strand and I'll basically double it over when I tie it in, and bring it back, and I actually won't even separate the fibers until I'm ready to fish with it. And I really just kind of pull them apart just a little. You don't need to do all this combing and stuff. It won't take long after a fish or two that you're going to have to get, and I'll use a stainless steel brush, and I'll just kind of brush them out a little bit just to kind of get it. But this is an example of a fly that's been munched on several times, and actually it probably was longer than this before. So sometimes the fibers at the end will get you can see these long pieces here, and so if you get like a short strip, you don't want them grabbing that. So a lot of times I'll actually cut it back each time, and then eventually you just retire the fly after several fish. But so this is I've kind of gone to where most of the time I fish with like a red, maybe with some silver on it. And so this is like this polar reflector flash, which I used to use, rabbit or some other materials like polymer up here, but this stuff really, I like it a lot. It gives it color and a little bit of flash. There's a little bit of this is called fly fur. It's actually I think it's longer, and I think a better alternative to craft fur, where a lot of guys use it. In fact, at first, I believe one of the first times I saw it was a guy who was tying pike or musky flies, and I get it from a place up in North Dakota actually that carries it, and so I'll use that, and I actually use this material on alligator gar flies a lot, which I'll show you in a minute. But yeah, but this is more or less the long nose pattern. A lot of times I'll tie them even simpler. Like this is chartreuse is sort of my other, real go-to color. And, I usually just use a red thread, and gives it a little bit of red in there. And then the main thing is you just want tie this rope in so it's really close to the back of the shank, because it's going to end up getting wrapped around the hook. So if you've got the rope tied in up here, it's going to get all mangled around the hook point. In some cases, you can cut the hook point off completely. So this fly has no hook at all. It's just I just take heavy duty wire cutting type pliers and cut the hook off. Now, I tend not to do that if I'm fishing somewhere where there are alligator gar, because I've only landed 2 alligator gar ever on a rope fly, and they were relatively small, and it was super fluky lucky. Like alligator gar you really cannot catch on rope flies. So I've actually never really I've tried to come up with a hybrid pattern that works like for both species really well. But the properties that make the rope fly really good for long nose really work against you for alligator gar. And I don't know if we want to go to that yet, or we want to kind of talk a little bit more about the long nose, and essentially how to go about fishing these flies for them.
Well, something for me, and John, jump in here if you want to, but we talk about multiple fish species. So you talk about spotted long-nosed alligator, and I can't remember. There's a fourth one, but
Short nose.
Short nose. Okay, so between those 4 different species of gar, let's say, what are the principal differences? Just ecologically, their feeding habits, their predatory habits. Are some daytime feeders or some nocturnal feeders. Obviously gizzard shad makes up the diet of the long nose, similar to the alligator gar. I mean, what are you looking for dynamically speaking? Because we can talk about, like, a comparative, like a salmon species where you could throw a jig in and they like to see that twitching action, right? So is it similar with the gar in their predatory instinct, where they want to see something that's kind of fluttering and wounded off to the side? Like, as long as the prey is wounded and susceptible, are they attacking it, or some more of the scavenger feeder type?
Well, that's a good question. And in terms of the smaller gar species, again, their feeding strategies are real similar, but they're generally going to be feeding on a lot smaller prey, and they may even be, like spotted gar will have known to, they'll eat crayfish, they'll, and spotteds tend to be more in river systems. You'll find them. Long nose and alligator gar can be in smaller, but mostly those are bigger rivers. So like smaller systems, a lot of times will be spotteds. Short nose can be pretty widely distributed. I don't know that much about short nose, but they're all over the place in the sulfur. I know that much, John. But again, for the most part, they don't get very big. The density of their teeth and the spotteds also make it so that they'll take these rope flies. If they're small, you can tie much smaller rope flies, but they tend not, because the density of their teeth isn't adequate. So it's almost like every species. So I'd say short nose and spotteds, you could use, really just small streamers with maybe a stinger hook, and you'll definitely catch them. You'll get some good takes. These bigger flies, they're just too big. They generally won't go for them. Occasionally they might, but and so in terms of what they eat, it's, they're all fairly like opportunistic ambush predators. It's just that the size of their prey really ends up differing quite a bit. Now, in terms of like scavenger, like obviously a lot of bait fishermen know that they incidentally catch gar when they're fishing, particularly like for catfish, if they're using fresh cut bait and things of that nature. So, gar are definitely attracted to smell, and they will eat, but they're not into like decomposing old nasty, they like fresh cut bait, things of that nature. And in fact, the alligator gar guides primarily, they use cut carp and sometimes buffalo, but buffalo and drum, and to some degree carp, are the primary prey species for alligator gar. And so there's some niche differentiation between those fish, because obviously if you've seen, smallmouth buffalo and carp and drum, they can be pretty good size, but they'll grab their prey the same way. And so I've actually gone to kind of learn more about alligator gar habitat and behavior. I've gone with a couple of the guides who are probably the longest running, and I don't mean to leave anybody out. If there's some other ones like Chris Moody, I think is a really long time running guide, but Byron Kirkland, who's Kirk Kirkland's dad, I fished with him for alligator gar probably 10, 12 years ago. And then Bubba Bedry, and both those guys were on River Monsters, I think. And so essentially the technique that they use is they're using big chunks of cut and carp generally is what they prefer. They'll use buffalo, but carp tends to be the best. And the fresher the bait, the better. And they basically have a 3/0 is kind of what they've all kind of come to. Is like, that's the biggest hook they can use that won't potentially kill the fish. And they'll hook this big chunk of carp, and a lot of times there's no weight. They'll just have like a big slip float that will kind of act as a lever where you can tell where the bait is, and just cast it out, and you just wait. And what the alligator gar will do is they tend to stay on the bottom. And what they do is they cruise along, and they're waiting for the same thing to happen. They're waiting for, because buffalo are a bottom feeding fish, and so are carp, so are drum. They're waiting for one of those fish to swim by and get in their zone, and then they ambush it. And that's how they feed. And so they fish this cut carp and bait on the bottom. But what they don't do is, once you, like, say you've got a fish that's grabbing and starting to, they don't set the hook right away, because they do the same thing that I was describing with the long nose. They will grab that bait and they hold it in their mouths. And some of it could be that, I've heard them say, like, well, they swim around because they're trying to find a spot to go eat it, so that other gar won't come and try to compete for it or whatever. That's probably partly true. I also think, though, it's their natural behavior to grab onto this fish, and they just hold and start crushing it to slowly kill it. And then they reposition that fish so that the head can go basically head first. That's how they swallow there. And so you'll see this float, and they'll have the bail open, or they'll have the live bait. I'm not that much of a bait guy, so I don't know all the terminology there, and you'll see this line, and it'll just be running around with it, and they wait until the fish stops, and they give it a second, and that fish is now swallowing the bait, and then you wail on them and you set the hook. And so pretty much all of that gar that you see, these monster gar that people are catching on the Trinity and other places, are being gut hooked with these treble hooks. The good news is they've been tagging these fish, and they're catching a lot of fish that they've caught and before. So there's some concern that gut hooking a fish is generally not good for most fish. But
Yeah.
at the same time, though, these guys are eating big fish that are spiny, and those big spines are going down in their esophagus and whatever else. So if you've got a hook that's not so big that's going to start puncturing back up into some of their vital organs or their swim bladder, it seems as though that bronze hook will eventually kind of rust out, and they'll kick it out. So you land fish, and then they actually cut the wire. They fish a 100 and some odd pound wire leader, and they'll just cut it, and then you let the fish go. And so you can see the similarities in the behavior of all of them and the way that they take. And so that leads, to, so for again, getting back to long nose, the way they grab it, and they'll have that in their mouths like this, a lot of times. And so if you just go to like set the hook or pull it, you might get them. Sometimes they get it right away, But usually what you do is this is where you try to unlearn what you've learned in fly fishing.
Yeah.
Is instead of you feel it and you them grab it, if you're blind casting, or if you see it and that you see him grab it, then I let go and I let them, and I count to 5. I give them a 5 count, and you'll see them and they'll be doing this. And every time they do that, it gets that rope slightly more, it's because it's loose, it's actually like getting more tangled in their teeth. And then I just gently raise up on the rod, and then they're obviously not feeling anything other than just tension on their mouth. They're initially pretty confused, and sometimes, and then once they realize what's going on, then a lot of times it's just off to the races.
Yeah.
And some of them will just dog you the whole time. Other times they'll take you in your backing. Obviously, if you're in a place where there's more flow, they'll really start running. And yeah, sometimes eventually, I wouldn't say I baby them, that you're usually, I'm putting a lot of pressure, and you can look on my Instagram. There's some where my rod is just often to the point where, like, if I put any more pressure on that rod, it would break. And that the fly is holding in their mouth. But just sometimes you'll look and you can see how it's in their mouth, and sometimes they'll open their mouth and it's like only in the top part, and they're shaking their head like this, and then you're like, okay, I got to be careful here, I'm about to lose this fish. And it just makes, it's all just part of the fun, I think. So those are some examples. But for guys who like to spin fish or don't fly fish, you can do the exact same thing. And one of the things that I do, I take friends out who don't fly fish, and I've basically tied that same fly, but I've taken these stainless steel bullet weights. If you can see that.
Yeah.
And so I'll actually use the same hook. I'll cut the bend of the hook off, slide the stainless steel bullet weight up to the front, and then basically tie the rest of the fly on this. And I would say you could do it on a shank, but you can't get this over the hook. So this slides over the hook after I've cut it off pretty nicely. And you can use bigger weights or whatever. And it's basically like a worm, kind of weight. But spin fishermen can cast this pretty far, and you can cast directly to fish and sight fish them, hold it up, or blind cast. And so spin fishermen can enjoy, alternatively, you could take a fly like this and just run one of these weights down your line, and maybe have a little swivel or something above it to keep it from moving too far, and you could cast that way as well. So this technique, works well for anglers who don't have fly rods too. So so it's simple, but it's pretty darn effective.
Dude, so how I guess before I ask this, please keep going if you're going to keep going for your flies.
No, that's just the gist
right.
of it. I've got lots of different variations of flies. These are the real most basic ones, but I encourage people to experiment with all sorts of things, even if they want to try doing hooking them or whatever. That's the fun of it, is particularly with fly fishing, is kind of coming up with your own creations and playing with it and seeing how it works and tweaking. And I've been doing that for years, and kind of settled in on these just because they're just work so consistently. But with that said, there's still probably a lot of opportunity for people to develop some neat new patterns that work well and in different ways than these.
My first gar I caught on the fly, and I was targeting gar. I caught on a white zonker strip with
I think I
it was on
remember
a
that.
it was on a size 2 eagle claw thin wire snell hook with
Wow.
and the hook didn't bend out, by the way. I distinctly remember telling Brian that, because I went on Brian's podcast on that exact day, dude. And it was just white zonker strip with this like copper polar chenille that I had palmered back for a belly.
Yeah.
And I was just throwing out, and I hooked like 4 or 5 gar that day. And I got 3 to the bank, and I didn't think I was going to catch them, but I had made this game plan in my mind. I had been mulling this over for days at work. Like, it's been raining a lot, it's flooded, there's going to be a lot of discharge. Every time there's a lot of discharge, I see them up on the banks. And so I'm like, I can cast that far. and I got this. The biggest long nose I ever got was on that white zonker strip, and I couldn't land it. I got it to the bank, and I was like, what am I doing?
Yeah, what do you do now?
I didn't have hemostats. I didn't have gloves. I was like, Earth to John, what are you doing here, man? So I'm down there in the rocks getting water in my boots, trying to get it off. And like, as I get down there to grab the fish, it's like, oh, see ya, bud, thanks. And it just swims off. I got it all on video. I was like, man.
But well, I mean, you basically leadered it, right? I mean, with marlin, it counts, right?
So for you though, did you know you had a possible state record? Because I'm going way back to the first of the podcast here. Texas state record, alligator gar on the fly through IGFA. Everything certified. I look at that all the time, and I get a little tear in my eye. How did you know that was the record fish when you hooked it?
Well, I mean, first of all, I gotta be honest in that, there are a couple of IGFA record alligator gar that were caught by Bubba Bedry's clients that are bigger in Texas, but he never submitted them to Texas. So that in terms of it being a Texas record, you go through the process. I mean, Texas doesn't recognize IGFA record. You have to submit, the paperwork, and so, but it was at the time going to be the line class record, world record for the 20-pound test, and for IGFA. So I sent it to both, and my line, my what's called your class tippet, tested at 0.05 pounds on average above. So it's actually 10 kilograms. So it's like 22 pounds is technically, so it gives you, so I was using 20-pound, and I'm going to say what it is.
Yeah.
It was Rio saltwater mono. And when I sent that in, the guy who was handling the record, he's like, everything checks out. This looks great. I just have to do the line testing. He goes, what type of line is it? And I told him, he goes, uh-oh. And I was like, what? And he's like, well, we'll see how it goes. But it's like, even the 16-pound Rio saltwater tests over 10 kilograms. And I was like, it hadn't occurred to me that because I have really hadn't messed with IGFA
Yeah.
before, hadn't occurred to me that when they say something is 20 pound, that it really might test like much higher, and so it ended up not being as bad as he thought, so the average was 0.05 pounds over and so it was disqualified from being the IGFA 20 pound line class. But Texas, on the other hand, in terms of fly fishing records, no one had submitted one this large, and so it's it's fun, but I also recognize that there have been at least a couple others caught on flies and that have been bigger. Now, with that said, I have hooked and cried afterwards because I have not landed much larger alligator gar, and this is the part where I'll show you alligator gar, a couple alligator gar flies. So with alligator gar, I use an entirely different approach. So that the rope from a rope fly, if you have hooks on that, say like you're trying to fish for long nose and alligator gar, and because a lot of times that's what we're doing is we'll see both, and we want, and of course I'll have the wrong rod in my hand. so I've tried to develop a hybrid fly, but you'll if you throw this fly that has a rope and hooks for an alligator gar, that rope will actually kind of get hung up in their teeth enough where they'll like kind of shake, and then it'll just pull out. So it actually impedes your ability to set the hook into their jaw, which is already extremely difficult to hook. And so gradually I've gone to a minimalist, so I use this fly fur that puffs up and creates a really nice profile. I like that so I've basically got a shank here and a trailer hook. And I've tried different hooks, and I've gone to more of a shorter shank, saltwater, kind of like a tarpon hook. And then I also take these hooks and then I sharpen them even more. And the goal here is to prevent, is to create a fly that has a nice profile, but when they take it, the material is not hanging on their teeth at all. Basically, you're trying to strip strike as hard as you can into their mouths and jamming that hook in there, and you don't want that material kind of hanging a little bit on their teeth and preventing that, because that just gives them more time to do what they're uncanny about this is once they start to feel that, they actually will I find that they turn towards me. Maybe it's just my imagination, it's just bad luck, I don't know, but it seems like they turn towards me and they open their mouths and they go like this. Mm-hmm. And at that point, it's most of the time it's over. It's just you don't have the angle to really set the hook, and a lot of times it comes out. So the other thing that they do, though, this gets back to their behavior, is you'll think you have them hooked. They'll bite down on it, and remember how I was telling you how they'll bite down on prey and they'll try to swim away with it. Well, their jaws are really strong compared to a long nose, and they'll bite down on that fly. And I'm doing the Billy Pate, tarpon. As many times as I possibly can, just like over and over and over. And I'm like, there's no way I don't have this fish hooked, right? And it's running off. And I've had fish over 7 feet long for sure. 150 pound alligator gar. And I'm like, and then all of a sudden they'll pull a line, and then they just come loose. And I think all those strips, I don't think the fly ever moved. I think it was, they were completely clamping down on that fly so hard that and if you're using an IGFA, which 16 or 20 pound line class, there's only so much you can only pull so hard before it breaks. And I have popped a couple trying to do that. So yeah, they're tough to hook for a lot of reasons. And but this style fly, which is a lot like a pike or a musky fly, but it's sparser. These hooks are so sharp. I'm like, just touching it and it's stuck to me. So, I've gotten where, it's probably about 20 to 25% of the takes that I'll hook and play them to the bank. There have been cases where I've been on like just like you were talking about, John, like on a bank where it's like I'm sinking up to my waist in mud as I'm trying to land this thing. And it's like literally sitting on the bank next to me and I'm reaching over trying to get it, and it's doing this with his mouth. And you see the fly kind of fall out. I'm like, no, and then it just swims away. I've had so many like weird cases like that. So it's really helpful to have someone, a lot of times that's when I'm by myself. It's really helpful to have a partner fishing with you who can help you land it. And a lot of the alligator gar guides, they basically use like a lasso, and you'll get the fish to the bow when it's tired, and then you slip the lasso over the rod and down and then over the fish, and you get it right behind the pelvic fins, and then they pull it, and then what they basically have got them, because it just the shape of the fish, and you just hold it tight. And a lot of times they'll lift them into the boat, or you pull over to the shore and then you can drag them in. Some smaller ones I have like a musky sling where you can kind of slide them in and then close it and then pull them up that way.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say was well, number one, when you do hook one of those fish because of their mouth and the bone structure, I mean, what happens with does the hook penetrate through? But also, our nets or slings like an optional item to assist in that landing, because I know that when you got that mouthful of teeth whipping around like this, it's probably not the most fun to go up there and actually try to get a hold of the fish. So
yeah, they're not like the glove method with an alligator gar is pretty much a no-go. Yeah. So some guy, for smaller ones, I've seen guides, they'll have these long-handled, like huge nets, but a lot of those nets are still too small for the big alligator gar, and so the lasso technique seems to be the universal approach that works really well. But again, the sling, the little or the little cradle that where you just slide them up and over and then close it down and then lift for some of the smaller ones. By smaller, I'm like 50 pounders. That method works okay too if you don't have that available. But yeah, having someone to help you land it is important. So that's been a major issue for me with alligator gar, because a lot of times I'm potentially out by myself, and and it's just counting down until that fly is going to come out. So, but to your point, Brian, you asked, sometimes you do get it to fully penetrate, and ideally what you want to get them in the corner of the mouth over here.
Okay.
And there's a little more soft tissue there. And so another big factor that's a lot of it is luck, is we're sight fishing and you're looking for fish that are cruising. I almost never blind cast for alligator gar. Mm-hmm. You're looking for a fish that's cruising, and a lot of times you'll see them 2 or 3 feet below the surface, just kind of hanging there. and be like, okay, there's one, you throw out in front of it. And the angle of the fish, like if it's, the worst is when you've got one that's like swimming right at your boat, because you cast at it, and I'm telling you, like 9 out of 10 times, if you don't spook them, they take it and they crush it. I mean, they
Man,
hit. I mean, it's
that's cool.
it's a really vicious take. I mean, they do not mess around. They're just crush it. And so you think for sure, but if it's facing you, again, that strip set, a lot of times it just doesn't get the right angle and it'll tend to pull. So sometimes I'll actually wait and hope it hangs on as it swims, maybe swims away. And a lot of times they'll drop it. So that whole part of the game is something I'm still working on. I know, where I fish and how I do it is not the same as like where like Bubba is getting a lot of these records. Like he fishes during really high flows in the spring. A lot of times they're in the backwater areas, and a lot of those fish are spawners, actually. Probably most of them are, and they're just back in, that's what they do during real high water years. They spawn in the floodplains, and in clear water, and he's able to see and target those fish. But for me, it's more of a summer low water thing, and I'm cruising around in pretty muddy water, hoping to see, ideally about, if you've got 12 to 18 inches of visibility, that's usually enough to fish. Obviously, the more the better, but most of the places where alligator gar occur are pretty muddy. So, so finding the right place to fly fish for them is probably the biggest limiting factor. Longnose are much more common, and you find them a lot below tailwaters, where water is going to be quite a bit clearer for at least a little bit of distance, and hence you've got more opportunities, I think, for those. But some of these rivers are just, the Trinity is just, it's like just gray, dark gray soup, zero visibility in the Trinity. I mean, there's basically no chance of catching an alligator gar in the main stem Trinity. You've got to find those backwater areas where some of the sediment's starting to settle out and there's a little bit of water clarity. So yeah, I know I've kind of rambled here, said a lot.
No, dude, you're good. This is
Good.
this is a lot of information to take in, but for me, I could listen to this all day,
Well, yeah, probably running a little long for your audience, though.
Oh no,
not at all.
no. So I do want to make a comment, but something I find some humor in, but I really appreciate at the same time. So we all found each other through Instagram, right?
Uh-huh.
And I didn't know who you were, dude. I had no idea. All I did is I looked up the hashtag gar on the fly. And I was like, oh, this guy's doing it too. And I clicked on it, and that post happened to be you posting the alligator gar coming out of the water, just exploding out of the water. And you were like, yep, this was the state record fish, and I was like, hold up, state record? And then you went on with everything about it. I was like, holy smokes, I got to talk to this guy. And what, Ryan, something I really appreciate about you, by the way, is when I reached out to you, you weren't tight-lipped. I asked you some pretty, I don't know, they may have been dumb questions to you, but I needed to know, right? So I asked you these questions, and you gave me legitimate answers, and you helped me get a really great understanding of this. I said this, during our break, but without Ryan's mentorship, I wouldn't be where I am as this gar addict. I'm dangerously close to being able to say that gar are my favorite species of fish.
Yeah.
And it's just the other hashtag that we check out a lot of analytics. We run several pages, and one of my favorite hashtags on your post is Texas Muskie. So how did that come about? Well, we've got some fun hashtags like Nick Feller, him and his partner, they have some cute hashtags for on their hiking stuff. And then, I've got like Bass Eat Bugs, but Texas Muskie. How did you come across that? At what point were you like, yeah, this is good? Because it's great.
I mean, there's, their muskies are, obviously muskies are not nearly as abundant as a long-nosed gar and, whatever, and really different in a lot of ways, but they're both like ambush apex predators, really toothy. And, I just, I think muskies are really badass. And,
Yeah.
and I kind of like the idea of people thinking of, gar species as apex predators versus like a trash fish, which is, the predominant view of a lot of fishermen, because, a lot of people aren't targeting them and they catch them and like, they're hard to handle and whatever. But, I mean, these are ancient, just really primitive. I mean, they have survived an amazing amount of environmental change over 150 million years, and they've changed relatively little. I mean, you look at the fossil record. I mean, and that to me is just so cool that we've got these fish right here in our backyard that have been around doing this for that long. And again, they're huge, and you can catch them on flies. And
Yeah.
it's, so I was just kind of one day I was just like, call it a Texas Muskie. And then I've just started putting that on posts with gar, just because I just tried. And I do have some guys from Wisconsin and Minnesota now like following me, and I get their muskie posts and stuff, so and a lot of the flies, I mean, this basically is a takeoff of, a muskie / pike pattern. And and that's, if for folks who want to target alligator gar, that's probably what I'd say is what I'd start with is just find some musky patterns, get some big musky flies that aren't too bulky, and have tandem hooks, really sharp hooks. And they're sight fishing is ultimately going to be your highest probability of getting them. And if the water's too muddy, you're probably not going to have a whole lot of luck. But if you can find some places where there's a little bit of clarity and you've got alligator gar, you got a shot. And I mean, there just aren't that many people who've caught alligator gar on flies, and the chance of a huge one, is just that I just think they're just so dang cool. So
They really are, man. I was reading about you got to forgive me because I've read this stuff, like the genus, right? Originally, gar were under the same Essex classification as I don't remember the date, as muskie and pikes and things of that nature. And I guess it was like late 1800s, early 1900s when that shifted, I believe. I don't know that for a fact, but so when I saw that's when I started reading about the genus of them, because a lot of guys, they put Essex for all their muskie posts. And I was like, oh yeah, that makes sense. And then, I read the gar genus. I'm like, yeah, I can't pronounce that, but
yeah. Yeah, Lepus osteus is the one for long nose and spotted and short nose. And there's also a Florida gar down in Florida that is Lepus osteus. And then there's it's Atrocosteus, which is the genus for alligator gar. Atrocosteus spatula is a species. And then there's a Cuban gar that's actually an Atrocosteus as well. And then there's another fish called a tropical gar that's even farther south. That's another Lepus osteus. So there's 5 Lepus osteus and 2 Atracosteus. There's 7 gar species in the world. Yeah, so yeah, even though, so it's kind of like we call convergent evolution in some ways. If you look at the body shape and, you know, the position of like the dorsal fin on pike in muskies is basically identical to gar. And that's probably one of the things that led early classifications, you know, to think of them as being real similar, but in reality, they're extraordinarily distantly related.
Yeah.
In terms of evolution. And so, but that convergent evolution is this idea that like there's a certain body plan that works, you know, and nature starts to select for that over time. And that long, slender, you know, being able, you know, ambush predator, just kind of lying in wait and being able to, you know, like muskies and pike like to hang out and in between logs and vegetation, you know, and having a big round thick body just, you know, it's not going to work very well, right? You know, so having that long slender, there's a lot of advantages, you know, to that. And so there you go. There's the similarities, but in terms of their relationships, and they're really very distantly related.
So you know, we talked about, you know, the different species and the targeting and the flies and all that good stuff. What kind of gear do you need to go out and get after these? We really didn't talk about the rods and reels, because I don't think you're going to want to go out there with something maybe not up to par. You know, when we talk about predatory species, they're big, they're strong, they're powerful, they have teeth. You know, they're capable of shredding line and snapping rods, and they can do it all. You know, anybody that's caught a pike or a muskie knows how explosive their attack is, and so I can only imagine with something of that size and nature that it has a pretty explosive attack itself. Anything predatory, right? So, what kind of gear do you need to get into it?
Well, I think with long nose, you know, you can go as light as maybe like a 7 weight. You know, one of the issues with that is that the flies, you know, themselves are, you know, particularly with wind, they're fairly bulky and wind resistant. And they, you know, particularly the rope will start to take on some water, and it can be a little bit harder, you know, harder to cast. So I typically use like a 9, about a 9 weight for long nose, but again, I'm oftentimes fishing. I know I'm fishing for 50-inch plus fish, and that seems like the right balance in terms of being able to cast big flies and then being able to put a lot of pressure on a big fish and keep it from running into, you know, wrapping me around stuff and so forth. Now with alligator gar, you know, for a while I was using a Scott heel applied saltwater rod 10 weight, and it was just not enough.
Wow, that's amazing.
And so, I mean, at least, you know, the ones I mean, there were some where I just couldn't. I couldn't put enough. I was like, I'm going to break the rod. You know, I mean, they'll just dog you, and you know, and you're just pulling, and you're almost trying to deadlift at some point. You know, when they get close to the boat, they just will not give up sometimes. And so I went to a 12 weight, but it was a fairly inexpensive rod, and it just still didn't have the backbone. You know, I landed, you know, those bigger ones, pretty good size ones, and hooked some bigger ones with it. And I'm pretty sure I could have landed, you know, up to maybe 100-pound fish in a boat and following it around for a long time, you know, if it had stayed hooked. But it just still, so I just recently got a new 12 weight. It's still not near, like, I can't afford those top of the line rods. You know, so Temple Fork makes a rod, an Axiom 2 X, I think.
Yeah.
And it's still not an inexpensive rod. I mean, but it's nowhere near the price of these other rods. And so I've matched that with, and I think the reel is probably, like, reels are, for me, most of the time, unless you're dealing with like tarpon and, or finesse fishing for trout with 7X, where you got to have a really precise drag and all that. My opinion, generally the reel is a place to store your line. and a decent drag system is important, obviously, but most reels, so I just recently got a Reddington Behemoth, the 11-12, and but I think the line is really important. So I would recommend spending more money on a line than I would on a reel. And so for like where I fit, in tech, it's just extremely hot, and a lot of these less expensive lines just like wilt, and you end up casting, and it's just, you end up with knots, and you're trying to it's really frustrating. So you need, so I ended up getting a Rio GT line. And one of the reasons for that too is that it has a 50-pound core. For a lot of fly lines are either 20 or 30-pound core lines, and there's probably some times where I'm gonna maybe just say, forget the IGFA part of this. I'm gonna just put straight like 40-pound, 50-pound, mono on this line, and I'm gonna just pull absolutely as hard as I can to try to set the hook on some of these alligator gar until I kind of really get it wired. And so yeah, and that line is designed for casting big flies in hot, very hot. I mean, they use that in the Seychelles. It's like 120 degrees there, so I would get like a tropical type line that's designed for throwing big flies, because of the hot weather. And I think it's for long nose also, kind of a tropical, like I use a tarpon line for the long nose, and that turns over the flies nicely. And again, it's all about like the heat, really, more than anything else. They make a lot of lines, that are like for throwing big flies, but some of them are not necessarily for hot tropical conditions, and that's where a lot of gar are. So I that's where I would focus my money, is get a, you don't need to spend a ton on the rod. The reel is somewhat important, but I mean, some of these reels are just insane in terms of but a good line, I think, is important.
So do you buy, I already know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask for the other people out there. So do you buy your own leaders, or do you tie your own leaders?
I tie them. So I basically tie what's more or less a tarpon leader. I do Biminis. So I'm familiar with the Bimini twist knot. It actually isn't that difficult, but the advantage of the Bimini, so it was like I tied 2 Biminis on what's called the class tippet, and the advantage of it is that you can get 100% knot strength, because you're essentially doubling the line where you tie it to your shock tippet, and then where you tie it to your butt section. So you get a butt section that could be tapered or not, depending on how long you go. And then your class tippet, which with IGFA has to be a minimum of 15 inches long. And what I have found in the past, I was trying to use, there's some knots out there, like a Slim Beauty and some others that tarpon guys use. And I was finding that when I would break, it would break at the knot. And I've now done these Biminis, and I've done sort of like what Billy Pate and those guys have shown, where you can wrap it around something and pull, and it will actually break not at the knot, it breaks like in the middle, like I'm amazed at like pretty, I mean, it makes sense that pretty much anytime your line's going to break, it usually breaks at one of the knots because that's just going to be the weakest spot. But with a Bimini, it's not true. So there may be some other knots out there that are close to 100% knot strength, but I've tried some of them that they say, and that's where I've broken. So I've gone to the Bimini and yeah, I'll sit there and, in the evening and, be doing rapping, and watching TV or something like that and tying up some leaders. It just takes a little bit of practice, but it's worth it if you're trying to, potentially fish for a record fish.
So with that being said, you said class tippet of 15 inches, but the leader itself from butt section to it's actually from the connection of the fly line to the butt section of the leader, correct? Is where the first measurement goes for it's no greater than 10 feet, if I'm not mistaken, from the IGFA standard for the entirety of it.
Honestly, I'm not sure about the entire length of your leader. There's the couple of the measurements are, it's from, in terms of 15 inches, it has to be at least 15 inches from the knots, so you've got 15 inches of class tippet that has no knot. And then your shock tippet, which I use for alligator gar, I often use like 100-pound hard mono. Some guys want to try to use wire. I think wire is really hard to fish with, and I've never had an alligator gar. Again, a lot of times you're hooking them outside the mouth, and it's not like these alligator gar guys that are gut hooking them and the line's like way down in their mouth and it's constantly rubbing on there. You're hooking them out here, and it's usually the trailer hook that's getting them, and so your line oftentimes is out here anyway. But your shock tippet can be no more than 12 inches from the fly to the knot where the class tippet is. And so if you're a little over 12 inches there, that disqualifies you. And you can use 2 hooks. You cannot use treble hooks. So if anybody uses a treble hook and says they've got a world record, it's disqualified automatically. So you cannot use treble hooks. Up to 2 hooks, and there's certain distances where they have to be. I mean, there's a lot of technicalities in it, but I do think there's some value in trying to use IGFA leaders, partly, just from a sporting perspective. And, if you did, potentially hook, a huge fish, and you're using, like I kind of suggested that I was going to do, but I probably shouldn't, like straight, 50-pound mono, and it just kept running and running. I mean, you might end up breaking your fly line, and then this fish has a hook and an entire fly line that's dragging around that could get wrapped around something, and the fish will die, and you've just lost a bunch of money, and so so it's probably better, for the fish. And the only reason why in theory, 16, 20 pounds should be plenty heavy in terms of the amount of pressure you can put on a fish on a rod. But it's really more about for me, it's about the hook set. It's about being able to I'd love to be able to put more pressure on them during the hook set. And, conventional anglers, they can use up to, I don't know, it's at least 135 pounds.
I was about to say it's 130. It's 130 pounds or something.
Yeah. So conventional anglers can go way, way, way up there. In fact, I fish with a friend he's running 80-pound braid, and he's fishing with big, musky, and he's got 2 treble hooks on it. And, we've just been experimenting, and he'll cast the alligator gar, and they'll take it, and he's got the drag completely turned all the way down. And then will just jerk as hard as he possibly can, and he's still and even then though he still like loses. I mean, he hooks slightly higher ratio of fish than I do, but it just goes to show that there's just a lot of things that have to work out just right for you to catch them that way. But I think that's cool. I mean, that makes it more exciting, and it's more of an accomplishment when you really do it.
Yeah.
And and then the smaller ones I tend to be a little easier to hook, just for a variety of reasons. But even the small ones though, like a couple of weeks ago, I had a couple hours to fish in a canal near a place where I was working, and I just went out, and happened to catch a 4-footer, and I weighed it. It was a little over 20 pounds. I mean, it was a 20-pound fish. I mean, it fought hard. It was a hell of a lot of fun. So, I mean, no, I mean, people don't scoff at baby tarpon, right? People go to the Keys and Everglades, and they're catching 20 to 40 pound tarpon, and it's a absolute blast. So smaller alligator gar are still a ton of fun, and they're still big. Anyway, yeah, you can tell I like this.
No, yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's okay.
It's fun.
Well, I think it kind of underscores the when we talk about the passion of pursuing a specific species, a lot of people don't understand that. They're like, why do you want to go fish for that fish so bad? But there's something about each species that I think draws in anglers. It could be the gar, it could be the muskie. I've heard many times over and over that many marriages have ended, and divorces filed, and major debts taken on for certain fish, in the fishing community. So if you're a part of the fishing community, and you're into the specific species of fish, you're going to really enjoy it. It doesn't matter, you could be you being from the Northwest, like a steelhead angler is like the equivalent of a muskie angler in the Midwest, or gar angler in the South, or a striper angler in Maryland, or or a tarpon angler in Florida. It's one of those things, or even a shark angler in California. It's like all regionally specific, and the people that go ballistic over it, they go ballistic. It's like, oh yeah, you totally missed this drawer tackle I have for this. Oh, did I show you this drawer tackle? Oh, here, let me go and pull out this whole box. There's nothing wrong with having that, because that. But the thing is this is how we learn more about the fish species, is because somebody really gets into it. Yeah, but it also helps to preserve and protect that fish species too, because we get so much joy out of pursuing that fish because of the challenge of the fish. It could be a fish that is as simple to catch as something that runs in a large number of fish, and somebody could just love it and say, hey, you know what, we need to do more to protect it. But with these big predatory fish, they are special. They're tough. They're tough, and they hit hard, they fight hard. And I think that's the big allure to pursuing the predatory fish species, is that's what they are. There's dudes that love to go after the channel cats, and they like, you have channel cats and walleye fishermen. Like the people get obsessive over walleye. They're like, man, all I want to do is fish for walleye. And you're like, there's other things now, but they're all garbage. It's walleye. Carp anglers in Europe,
Yeah.
that's it's like,
oh yeah, carp.
And I sit there and I watch it, and I'm like, you just kind of, how can you fish for that? You're always looking for that action, that flash in the run, or like you said, sight fishing. So I think it's cool, and I think that the fact that that focus on that record is just super cool, but also the IGFA stuff, but also your intimate understanding of the biology of the fish is really just that's the pinnacle. It's not even like the catching of the fish or anything. It's like the respect for the place in the ecosystem for the species. And I think that's one of those things that a lot of people, yeah, there's fish species out there that you can, I guess, say, oh yeah, well this needs a special thing. Trout is one of those things where people are like, oh, you have to gently handle the trout. We have to make it a down bed and lay it down in the river so gently. And then you see, other people take them and huck them like a Nerf football. But outside of that, it's more about the respect and understanding of the place in the ecosystem for the gar.
Yeah.
As you guys said, and you both live in gar country, a lot of people refer to these fish as trash fish. Largemouth and smallmouth bass are considered trash fish here, and it's because they look different. They don't have that silvery side, and they typically live in water and river systems that aren't classically Western. They're not clear running streams with the gravel bed. They're not the Metolius, they're not the Deschutes. They're living in stuff like this pond that smells like garbage, or comparatively, or it's living in a river that's full of a bunch of pollution. But I think the preservation of the species is so important, especially since it's a prehistoric survivor. I mean, look at what that fish species has survived through time, where other species have went extinct. It's just incredible to me. So your passion for it is cool.
Yeah. Well, and I think very well said. And I think that's, where a lot of it comes from, is just, the very first time I caught, particularly an alligator, it was just, I really just wanted to come in contact with one, to touch it and see it, and up close, and just, and it was just out of like this tremendous respect for this, really primitive, just amazing, species. And so it's, it's good that alligator are getting more positive attention from the angling community. I will say, one of the concerns I have about like talking about, gar fishing and stuff, is that there's also, a burgeoning bow fishing community out there.
Mhm.
And, while I think bow fishing is perfectly, probably a very fun activity, and, there's no catch and release with bow fishing. And when you have a fish like an alligator gar that, can live to 100 years, and, a lot of them, big ones, are certainly over 50 years old. They're not, people maybe do eat some of the bigger ones, but they're loaded with mercury. I mean, they're not, you shouldn't eat fish that big anyway. And so dump them, and it's just, that fish deserves something a lot better than that, I think. And so there are some new regs in some places where they're saying you can only take one fish in the Trinity. I think right now, like, you can only get one per year, large alligator gar, and then the rest you can keep one per day under 48 inches. And that's partly because that river has started to experience tremendous amount of fishing pressure. Some of the other rivers that have more difficult access, like the Brazos and the lower Colorado and some others, I'm very concerned. This is one of the reasons why we're doing research. We're actually collaborating with Texas Parks and Wildlife, trying to develop some non-lethal techniques for assessing the health of both the ecosystem and the fishes themselves, of alligator gar. Because I think there's certain stretches of these rivers where, if bow anglers were able to get in there, they could wipe them out. I'm convinced that they could be completely wiped out in a relatively short period of time. And so I think access has saved alligator gar in some of the rivers. And so so a lot of our research is to help inform managers to maybe see that, hey, maybe this sort of regulation should go statewide, or at least in some other places. So
maybe I don't want to cut you off here, John, but when you talk about that bow fishing and everything, I think it looks like a lot of fun, but yeah, it's a one and done deal. You thump and you reel in the fish and it's dead. What, for the people that just maybe don't quite understand, because you do have your background and education in understanding how an ecosystem really works in depth, what happens when you remove that predatory species from that water body? And I know that with a short, quick answer, but what you're looking at directly in your research, what is the potential, what could happen if you didn't have that species in those waterways?
Well, I mean, they're apex predators, they're top-down control on, essentially, a lot of other species that might compete more with, say, fish that people are more interested in catching, like catfish. So if you had, a proliferation of buffalo and drum and some of these other species that could interfere with the populations of, say, those more desirable species. But more directly, you're potentially losing, a fish that is, if you're talking about an individual really large fish, it's almost certainly a female, and it's old, and it has the good genes, and it has the capability of reproducing, producing a lot of eggs.
Mhm.
And so you take that female out of the gene pool, and you're so it's kind of a double whammy in that, yeah, this was a big one, had good genes, and you've lost all those eggs. And it's going to take a long time for a fish to get that big to replace it, if they do. So there's that component as well. And then, eventually, alligator gar have been largely extirpated from a lot of their native range. So that remaining really robust populations are primarily in Texas and Louisiana. And they've tried to even reintroduce them in some places as far north as Illinois, because we're in that area, all through the Mississippi drainage. And so yeah, I mean, so there's multiple levels of things going on there. And if someone says, well, I just don't value that fish, well, then there's a lot of us who do.
Mhm.
So I think finding some sort of balance between those who want to do that sort of thing and those who want to conserve is, I think, kind of where we need to be. I'm sure there's some sort of a sweet spot. And this is probably going to really upset the carp anglers, but there are non-native invasive exotic species like common carp that are actually in some places a real problem, a real nuisance. They can create tremendous amounts of turbidity in the water, and uproot vegetation, and some other things. And and then you start thinking farther north of some of the other, like Asian carp, the silver carp, and
I
those.
imagine that.
I would love to go bow fishing for those.
Yeah, exactly.
It actually would be a beneficial thing. So there's invasive exotics that I think really would be great targets for bow fishermen.
Absolutely.
But the native fish, I think we need, at a minimum, regulations that limit how many you can kill and what size, and people need to be able to identify what they're shooting.
Yeah.
You can't just shoot any duck, right? I mean, you got to know what you're shooting at.
Yeah.
and that's a lot farther away typically than the fish. People argue, well, I couldn't tell what it was. Well, you need to learn. I think that's my opinion on it. So I'm not anti bow fishing altogether, but I think there needs to be some regulations, and Minnesota recently is starting to look at putting some regulations on the number of longnose or other gar that can be killed. There was you may have seen some of it on social media where there was some guys who killed over 1,000 longnose gar in one day. And these were almost certainly fish that were probably in spawning areas. So they must have just been and they filled they had a huge boat and they filled the entire hull.
Were they taking them for food?
No. And then they took them and they filmed it, and they filmed them dumping them into the lake, and they counted over 1,000 because they thought it was good for the gram, they did it for the gram.
Well, that's what I don't get. Okay, so yeah, I catch and keep fish. John catches and keeps fish. I'm sure that you've done plenty of it in your life. I love to eat fish. What in the hell possesses somebody to go kill that many damn fish and then throw them away? I just don't. It just sickens me. I don't understand it. What a waste of life.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's, and it's sort of, I think, a cultural view that like, hey, that they're trash and they're eating, game fish, which is totally untrue. I mean, again, like I told you, longnose are primarily eating. Yeah, they may compete a little bit with some fish in terms of eating shad, but they're not actually eating like largemouth and smallmouth bass or walleyes, or very rarely are they eating those. So this concept that gar are interfering. I mean, generally they're completely benign, and they're important parts of the ecosystem, and they've been, like I said, they've been around for a long time, and it is just like a total waste. And while they are difficult to clean, gar are actually pretty good to eat.
I imagine.
They have a really white, firm flesh. As long you don't kill big ones, the smaller ones, their mercury levels are acceptable, and it's a firm. It's not trivial to clean it. You got to learn. A lot of times people are using like tin snips and some other things to get.
Big deal.
But yeah, they absolutely are edible. It's just a perception. So I would, guys who, I'd like to see people, there's also wanton waste laws out there, they like, and sometimes I say, well, it doesn't necessarily apply to non-game fish, but I don't think that's right. At least you got to be using them for bait or something along those lines, and to just completely, discard them like that is hopefully something that will change.
Hopefully. You're talking about, I'm not going to mention the rivers again, but we'll say river A and B with the harder entries, right? There's no like it's not really accessible unless you really want to fish there. I believe that pressure, like you were saying earlier, I strongly believe pressure like that would completely wipe out that species of fish from those rivers. That was an issue with the Guadalupe bass. I mean, look at the Guad, right? Like you've recently caught some, and I've only ever caught one, but they're a very threatened species, and I would be incredibly sad if we had more fish become like that. We have to have something put in place here soon, at least in Texas, like statewide, or we're going to lose these fish. They're just going to be gone. I know they spawn pretty frequently, and we got a lot of people. It's a big state, at some point where you're going to overfish it, you're going to overkill, and then you're not going to have these fish anymore. Maybe they're not quote game or sport fish, but you're going to lose them.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree completely. Yeah. This whole concept of, game versus non-game fish. I think we just need to, think about this. And I think all species probably need to be managed in some way, and with some degree of limits and seasons and so forth. But that's, I think slowly that may be coming, but I'm just worried that it may be coming too slow.
So, well, I'm looking at the timer here.
Yeah.
You've given us a ton of awesome information, Ryan, and it's just absolutely awesome to talk to you, because it's so nice to meet somebody that is passionate about any specific species as you are, but also the variety of species, the places you've been, the places you've fished. It's super cool, but also the fact that you're willing to sit down and talk to everybody about how they could get into a really awesome predatory CNR fishery for a predator. A lot of people are like, well, I don't know. We've known about it with muskie for a long time and pike, but the gar species, you see a lot of stuff like, oh, I'm going to go bow fish for the gar. I'm going to do this. So, you saying, hey, I'm going to go pursue them on a fly or conventional tackle. And by the way, instead of killing it, I'm going to pop the hook out of its mouth, or, do the response, whatever I need to do, in regards to the responsibility part of that. You figured that out, and you laid out a really great framework today for that, like how to responsibly angle, and you also gave very in-depth insight, ecology of the fish is super cool. So if people want to get a hold of you and talk to you more about gar fishing, because I mean, we could probably go on a long time, but if they want to get in touch with you, is there a good way for them to get in touch with you?
Well, I mean, on Instagram, I've had several folks, message me, people.
Give me like 5 seconds.
People
Oh,
have,
sorry.
commented on some of my posts, but I'm happy to answer questions through, if people want to message me on Instagram, and give me a follow, and I'll follow back, and we'll talk gar. And yeah, I've really just started, probably 6 or 8 weeks ago in earnest, on Instagram. And I've been kind of overwhelmed by how awesome the community is of people, just like meeting you guys. And, it's like I had been on Facebook for a long time, and I was just like, I'm done with this. I just like politics and people talking about stuff that, whatever. And I dumped that in. And I was on Twitter, I'm still on Twitter, but it's mostly work. It's mostly academic colleagues. And it's a lot of it's like, boy, it's pretty heavy. And, and so to have a place where I can like just actually be me, not the Dr. King, the professor, has to be a certain way, like to be like, hey, I can just be part of this fishing community and post pictures of fish and comment on other people, and have already met new people. And it, in just such a short period of time, I'm like, man, I really missed out. I should have been on this a long time ago. So I'm looking forward to, meeting more people on Instagram. So that's so anyways, but so really thanks to you guys for inviting me to talk here. I mean, I know there are other guys who know a ton about gar and probably know a lot more than I do. And so I hope, but I was glad that you guys gave me a chance to kind of tell what I know. So,
Dude, honestly, thanks so much. Like your influence has kept me on the water, kept me on the hunt, and just thank you so much for coming on today, dude. It's been a blast, and I've learned a lot. And just thanks, man.
Hey, you bet, guys. Yeah, absolutely. So thanks again, and I guess we'll hopefully get to fish together sometime. How about that? Would that be all right?
Oh yeah.
If I can make it down there to Texas with you guys, definitely.
Sounds good, Brian. You need to come down.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Well, Ryan, thank you. Also, thank you for your experience and everything that you've added in today. It's really cool, and really happy to have you a part of our little niche community there on Instagram with all of our fishing folks and hiking folks and all that kind of stuff. We're all over the place. It's super eclectic, but it's so much fun, So it's a lot of fun for us to get together. But so with all of that, I guess until next time, if you want to get a hold of us, you can get a hold of us via Instagram at Working Class Fishing. You can also email us at workingclassfish@gmail.com. Check us out over on YouTube under Working Class Fishing, and you can also find us on any of the major podcast platforms. So until next time, get out there, get fishing, and I hope everybody has a great day.
See ya.